The Census Project says the warning signs are back, calling the path to 2030 a Census Groundhog Day moment that echoes the trouble of 2020. From lagging timelines to unresolved operational risks, their reports suggest the Bureau is once again running out of runway. Steve Jost and Howard Feinberg join me to explain what's at stake. Steve is a senior advisor for Avoq and a consultant to the Census Project. Howard is Senior VP for Advocacy at the Insights Association and co-director of the Census Project. Steve and Howard, it's so lovely to have you both on the show this morning.
Great to be here.
Steve, I want to start with you. A recent report from the Census Project says it feels like Census Groundhog Day. What do you mean by that?
Well, we're glad to be here, Terry. Thank you for inviting us. And what we mean by it is this administration seems to be rerunning the bad planning in advance of the 2020 decennial count, which was widely considered one of the lowest quality census in this century. Now, most of that was due to the timing of COVID while we were conducting that 2020 census, but there were a lot of other operational issues, including Congress not funding the testing regimen that was put in place before that census. And they cut back tests in 16, in 18, and in 17. And I was there at the Census Bureau for both the 2000 and the 2010 decennial counts, and we got hammered by the General Accounting Office every year for not having sufficient testing. And they were big on end-to-end testing. And when you have such a massive, diverse country, diverse geography, diverse population, you need to customize the census for localities, and not testing in enough localities is going to lead to a problem.
Howard, Steve has just mentioned some problems that are starting to recur again. We're still 4 years out from the 2030 census. What are the main warning signs from your perspective that lead to this concern about how we're preparing for 2030?
Well, I think we've already been on a similar trajectory as the last decade in terms of continuing resolutions as a method of funding the Census Bureau, as it's works for many agencies these days. That means that a lot of preparations and research gets kind of punted ahead because the Bureau never is entirely certain how much money they will have available to conduct things. That was the primary driver for the elimination of almost all the tests in the last decade. Continuing resolutions, government shutdowns, that all meant that they didn't really know if they'd be able to fund tests, and thus we were reduced in the 2020 census cycle to a test of only Providence, Rhode Island, which does not capture a whole lot as it relates to the diversity of the entire country. So there were no tests in the last cycle of rural areas, remote areas, native populations, and tribal areas. Like, there are whole swaths of the country there was no testing done whatsoever. That led to some of the inaccuracies that came out in the 2020 census, and that they were just going in kind of unprepared in many respects. The Bureau does their best, but there's only so much they can do without testing. And this time around, the 2026 census test was scheduled with 6 different sites, for the most part, very different splotches of the country, designed to really get that diversity of populations and different kinds of areas, different kinds of group quarters, in addition to individual households. And that's been reduced to only 2 sites in Spartanburg, South Carolina, and Huntsville, Alabama. There are political and, I assume, financial reasons behind the reduction to those specific spots, but it does mean that the rural and remote areas are left out in the cold. And that's one of the areas where we had a lot of issues with inaccurate counting in the 2020 census. So you'd think you would want to prepare and turn that situation around when you're getting ready for the 2030 census. And I'm worried that that's not going to happen under this kind of plan.
Steve, let me come back to you because Howard has just talked about the importance of these tests. What does the Bureau need right now to stay on schedule? Do they need more money? Do they need more people? Do they need new technology? Do they need all of the above?
Well, it's a great question. And there are a lot of things they need. They need more time. They need more money. They're using technology, and you have to test that. There's an online response, and you have to test how people respond to the online questionnaire and if there's any problems with it. The census is labeled as the largest peacetime mobilization that the government conducts. It's $13 to $15 billion over a 10-year span. It's 750 to 800,000 temporary employees hired and deployed in a year ending in zero. And unlike an aircraft carrier where you get to test it out on the seas before you deploy it for a military mission, you got to get it right the first time with the census. There is no chance to redo it. And that's why the tests are so vital, to make sure that you've covered every base, every undercounted population, new methods. The biggest undercounted population is young children, by the way. People misunderstand that the form is about adults and they leave their children off. And that requires a really diverse education campaign to explain to people, no, we need to know everybody who's in your household, even if they're not related to you.
I'm speaking with Steve Jost, who's Senior Advisor at Avoq and a consultant to the Census Project, and Howard Feinberg, who is a Senior VP for Advocacy at the Insights Association and co-director of the Census Project. Howard, let me come back to you. We've talked about testing. We've talked about funding shortfalls. What are the biggest operational risks if these issues don't get resolved soon?
Biggest operational risks, well, there are a whole bunch, I think, but testing is a key to figuring out how you're going to be able to deal with unexpected circumstances, and not just the expected. You'd have to prepare for known unknowns and unknown unknowns. The last cycle we had COVID, which was definitely in the unknown unknowns as far as anyone I know. But who knows what happens next? And you need to be prepared to roll with the punches. And I think that means the Bureau needs to be focusing on core functions and its big picture demands. At the Insights Association, where we represent the market research and analytics industry, we've been very focused on trying to keep the Bureau on task instead of experimenting with attempts to compete with private industry, which they've done against our own industry, trying to build big public online panels, which they don't know how to do and have failed miserably at. We want them on task and putting all their resources and their attention to being prepared for this massive count of the population, because they only get one shot at it every decade.
Steve, the census data is so important to programs at all levels of government, federal, state, and local. And yet the approach the government seems to be taking is a little passive aggressive. It's almost like we don't actually want to know the census data, because then we'd have to do something with it. So as you look at all of these conflicts and shortfalls, what is the impact if the 2030 census doesn't get a good count?
Well, it's pervasive across the country for a decade. The census numbers are used to determine federal funding, $1.6 trillion in spending, according to the Census Bureau, is determined by census results. So you have that. If you're undercounted in Des Moines for whatever reason, then you're going to suffer with underfunding in Des Moines for the rest of the decade. And, the census folks, I'm not going to go to motivations. I think it's just a misunderstanding of the complexity of the task. The Census Bureau has to go out and count people that are living on motorhomes, living on boats, in tree houses, in converted garage apartments that weren't reported to the local government and don't have a mailing address of their own. And they're not a law enforcement agency. They don't care about your status, but they do have an obligation to try to count everyone. And, we even have to count the Unabomber, who famously didn't want to get counted or discovered by anybody. But when the FBI found his cabin in the forest, they found a census form hanging on the doorknob.
Howard, do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, and I think the impact is also across all other research that's done in the country, including all the other research by the federal government. There's always an assumption that we can just sort of back up and, if we make a mistake In the decennial, we'll just plug it in with the American Community Survey data because that's the old census long form now every year. But the American Community Survey is building its sampling frame off of the census data from the decennial, as is every other survey in the country. Both private and public sector. So all the decision making in the country is ultimately coming back to information out of the decennial.
So, Howard, what are the most urgent actions that Congress needs to take in the coming months to prevent a repeat of last cycle where, as Steve said, it was the worst count in recent memory?
Well, certainly immediately getting in touch with the administration about the 2026 test, I think, is the biggest priority, and being very vigilant on that front. But after that, it's getting ready and passing funding for the Bureau, including giving them authority across multiple years to spend it so that they're not stuck when CRs pop up.
I've been speaking with Steve Jost and Howard Feinberg. Steve is an advisor at Avoq and a consultant to the Census Project. Howard has been co-director of the Census Project and is senior VP for advocacy at the Insights Association. Thank you both for keeping us up to date on this important project.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having us.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.